Well, hi everyone. My name is Carla Grados. I am co-head for Latin America at 60 Decibels. We are a global social impact measurement company. And welcome to this Brazil-specific webinar, our first Brazil-specific webinar at 60 Decibels. We'll be sharing a bit more on who we are and why Brazil, and sharing a bit more about our fellow speakers. But before, I want to share briefly the agenda so you know what we're going to be talking about today in this 1 hour space. So first, we're gonna give a small introduction about 60 decibels and how we measure social impact for those who don't know us and wanna know a bit more about our methodology. Then we're gonna briefly mention why this Brazil webinar. Why are we having or conducting our very first Brazil specific and one of our very first country specific, I would say, webinars for 60 decibels. Then we're gonna move on to two very interesting cases that we have with us today. One is the Estímulo case, and the other one is the Saison international case. So for the Estímulo case, I will first give an introduction on how we work with organizations that want to measure their impact directly. In other words, that have direct relation with their end users or beneficiaries or clients. And then Lucas Conrado, I'm gonna briefly introduce him also in a bit, is gonna share his experience from the Estímulo perspective. And then we're gonna move on to the portfolio lens. How do we work in Brazil as well when we work with an organization that has different organizations in its portfolio? And finally, we're gonna have a Q&A space. And in the portfolio section, Pranav is gonna be conducting a Q&A with Mariana Bénard, who comes from Saison International and who also we're going to briefly introduce in a minute. So that's our agenda. Again, if you want to know more about any of these particular case studies we're going to be sharing, please go ahead and share a Q&A. If we don't get to answer your questions today, we're going to be sure to answer them in a follow-up email. So now, officially, our speakers, well, of course, me and Carla. I wish eventually I will be able to conduct a webinar like this in Portuguese or Portuñol. For now, it's going to be in Spanish, also for a more international audience. It's also here also with me is Pranav Sridhar, my colleague. He's head of sales of Europe and Asia, and the one who has more relationship with global organizations that are working with companies, NGOs, in between others in Brazil. We have Mariana Bénard, of course, head of impact and senior VP at Saison International. And we have Lucas Conrado, Executive Director at Estímulo. I'm going to quickly share a small introduction on Estímulo and then pass it over to Pranav so he can share a small introduction on Saison International and kick us off officially. So Estímulo is a Brazilian nonprofit organization that uses blended finance to expand access to capital for underserved micro and small businesses. It was founded during the COVID-19 pandemic as a relief fund and has supported more than 6,000 entrepreneurs and deployed over 80 million US dollars in capital through a fully digital platform. The organization operates at the intersection of financial inclusion, entrepreneurial development, and impact investing, combining philanthropic and private capital to reach businesses that are often overlooked by traditional financial institutions. And this is what was the lens of the measurement we did with them. And Lucas, of course, is going to be sharing more about this. And more recently, Estímulo has deepened its work in two major areas: post-climate disaster economic recovery and supporting small urban entrepreneurs in the Amazon region. And with that, I'm going to pass it officially over to Pranav so he can introduce Saison International and kick us off. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Carla. And once again, a huge warm welcome to all of you from around the world and from Brazil for joining us for this really exciting conversation. It's an absolute pleasure to be introducing Mariana, who heads Impact at Saison International. And I'll be saying a lot more about them, and she'll be saying a lot more about their work. But in a nutshell, Saison International is the international headquarters of Credit Saison Company Limited. And, founded in 1951, it is one of Japan's largest non-banking financial companies, and it's listed also on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. What's really exciting is while this story started over 75 years ago in Tokyo, Saison International was created 12 years ago to really support Credit Saison's expansion overseas. And it's built a tremendous, robust experience across South and Southeast Asia, and more recently expanded into Latin America as well. So we'll dive a lot more into that, but a huge thank you to Mariana for joining us for this conversation and sharing that global perspective with a strong foothold in Brazil. With that, Carla, maybe we can dive into a bit of an introduction about ourselves. So for those of you who don't know us, I'll begin with a fun fact, which is that 60 decibels is the audio level of two humans having a conversation. So right now, I'm trying to speak to you at 60 decibels, although in my excitement, I might go above that. The reason that's our name is because our mission is to listen better to communities around the world who are participants and recipients of socially minded products and services. We work in 100 plus countries and growing around the world, and we do that by conducting short 15 to 20-minute local language phone interviews to really capture the lived experience of people around the world. So, how do we work? And what really is lean data? So, on the next slide, we're going to sort of learn a little bit in a nutshell who we are and what we do. Put simply, we were born and we were created to offer a fast and rigorous human-centered approach to impact measurement. If you look at the journey on your screen, it begins with listening to individuals about their experience of a socially minded product or service, understanding who they are, what their experience is, and how something has either impacted them positively and potentially negatively, so that we can use that information to serve them better. When we do that in a standardized, systematic way, that's what begins to become measurement, the ability to understand what's working and what's not. That standardization, when done across tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of customers in communities around the world, helps us benchmark social performance, which again is telling you not just how well you're performing on certain key impact indicators, but how that contextualizes, compares, contrasts with other service providers in the same domain. So you can really begin to understand what's working and where you can improve. And last but not least, all of this is in service of action, in improving our impact over time, not just proving it. And again, it's nice to see a fun visual which captures our ethos, which is a combination of customer intelligence for improved product design, customer service, and engagement, and impact measurement, really holding ourselves accountable to the people we're trying to serve and using that as a mechanism to improve our impact. And so how do we go about implementing lean data around the world? So there are a few key pillars of how we do this. Carla, if you can move on. So first and foremost, it's data built by listening. So most of our research is conducted by conducting local language phone interviews around the world, including in Brazil. And increasingly, we're also testing a range of new innovative data collection techniques via WhatsApp, SMS, IVR, including testing early AI solutions. Our goal is to keep this burden-free for everybody involved. The respondents, first and foremost, to keep the interviews short so we can capture their experience without being too burdensome, and actually turn this data around in a matter of months rather than years so organizations can use it for decision-making. Again, it's conducted largely by the phone by real people. And again, I emphasize it again and again, which is our goal with this webinar and more work like this is to crowd more work happening, such research happening in Brazil, so we can get meaningful benchmarks and improve how useful the data is. The last thing I'll say before I hand over to Carla again is, some of the other things that we're doing at 60 decibels relevant to this. So just to give you a snapshot of our ecosystem map, which captures, as of right now, our understanding of the different impact investors operating in the ecosystem, who they're raising money from, who they're investing in, so that we as an ecosystem can become more transparent and aware of the types of ways in which capital is available, accessible for greater impact. And this is just one example of that. It's free to use. If you just go online to our website, you can find it. And over time, our goal is to really have many, many more of these investors and social businesses and NGOs really listening to their end communities in a systematic, meaningful way across the board. So that's really a glimpse into us at 60 decibels. I'll pause there and hand back to Carla.
Amazing. Thank you, Pranav. And just before moving on to why Brazil and why this webinar, I just want to share, or please encourage you to jump onto the ecosystem map, where I'll share a link via the chat, so we can start mapping the Brazil ecosystem. This is a global tool, but as more Brazilian actors are filling in their data on companies or funds or NGOs in between others, we're going to be able to see these linkages, and this is public information that is useful for everyone. So now moving on, why Brazil and why now? So we've been working for nearly a decade in Brazil, measuring in the way Pranav shared, originally with a lot of global organizations, global funds, global grant makers, global impact investors, in between others, and global organizations such as the case of Mariana with Saison International. And this has allowed us to start understanding more about the end users in this ecosystem, in the Brazilian ecosystem. But of course, this is not enough, right? We've been working way more in Latin America, in other countries of Latin America, such as Mexico or Colombia. And lately, we've been very, very keen to increase the work in Brazil. But before sharing why specifically, just a glimpse on our work up till this date. We work with around 21 clients and 32 company studies. Why more company studies and clients? Because many of these clients have a portfolio of organizations and they measure more than one. And then 46 projects. So why more projects than companies? Because in certain cases, the company is measured more than once. So we're able to see their longitudinal impact, like if impact is changing year over year. And this has allowed us to have on the ground more than 15,000 conversations with Brazilians in 3 different languages, not only Portuguese. And that is the main or a really important aspect of the methodology, is that it has to be super incredibly human and build trust between the one that is applying a survey and the one that is answering that survey. And that's why conducting it in the local language is key, super, super important. And in Brazil, of course, there's more than 3 languages, but till this date, we've only used 3. And the idea would be to increase the number of languages as well. And the main work we've done in Brazil is specifically across financial inclusion. That is the case with Lucas and Mariana, also MSME support, also the case with Lucas, and in a lower extent, education, agriculture, and workforce development. But we're very keen to explore other industries as well or strengthen our information and therefore benchmarks and publicly available data in other sectors. So again, why Brazil? Brazil, as all of the Brazilians here, I'm sure know, and many of the internationals, is a regional pioneer in sustainability. It was the first Latin American economy actually to mandate sustainability and impact reporting standards for companies in all of the region, in all of Latin America. And when it comes to impact investing, it is the lead, together, of course, with Colombia and Mexico. But Brazil is still the undisputed leader. And it's not the country we're working the most in for many different reasons. But now we are growing in that activity. And we really, really, really want to increase it. So these benchmarks that Pranav mentioned are stronger. And the stronger these benchmarks are, the more aggregate public analysis we can do to share with the ecosystem. In all of the sectors we mentioned, but one particular sector that is super interesting, for example, is regenerative agriculture or related aspects. That is a key theme for the future. And Brazil is also, again, a leader in this theme. So this is a bit or a small introduction on why Brazil and why now. And what we would love to reach eventually is a country level report similar to the one that we did for Latin America regionally. So what you're seeing on your screen right now is a small glimpse of the Latin America snapshot, where we aggregated 197 studies in 18 countries, including Brazil, of course, that aggregated almost 31,000 voices. And the reason why we aggregated all of this data and did a public analysis that is useful for the, let's say, Latam ecosystem is to understand where is impact happening from the perspective of the end user. And that is, from our understanding, the most important perspective. Can we share the presentation? Yes, of course, Priscilla, we can share the presentation. You can, let me just mention this again, you can share questions with us directly via the chat, but we please ask you to add it in the Q&A whenever it's a general question so everyone can see it and vote on it. But some themes that emerge from this LATAM report and that we would love to explore for Brazil specifically is that, for example, as you may imagine, we measure the impact pioneers, the ones who want to be measured. And the impact pioneers are indeed reaching low income and underserved individuals and MSMEs, but not necessarily those in extreme poverty, for example. And if the impact pioneers are not reaching them, then who are, right? So this is a super important insight that we got at a LATAM level. Another, I would say, key one related to the methodology that Pranav mentioned is that there is a direct relationship between social outcomes experienced by people and experience or satisfaction, or the probability to recommend an intervention. Why is this important? Because it's not only about the attributes of a product or a service, but the impact on my well-being in medium and long term. So if there's a positive impact, I'm going to recommend that intervention. And therefore, that intervention is going to scale. And this is a correlation that you see here for the 197 studies. We would love to explore that for Brazil, or maybe for sector-specific cases. And there's other themes that we are happy to share on the LATAM report, but are like what we really want right now is to explore it at Brazil level. So the more that we're able to measure in Brazil, the more data we have to produce a public, fully free report for Brazil that is useful for the Brazilian ecosystem. And that is what we consider from what we can do that is currently missing. So that is the small introduction to us and to why Brazil and to why this webinar. But let's now dive into the two cases that we want to share with you today. So we're going to start with the Estímulo case. And before moving on to Lucas and his experience with this process in Brazil, let me share a bit more about the company lens or the direct impact lens. What do we mean by this? So as Pranav briefly mentioned, we, and I did as well, we have two ways of working. The first and the most usual one, and the way we started working, because something I forgot and we forgot to mention is that 60 Decibels is a spin-off out of Acumen. Acumen is a global impact investing fund. And the methodology that was designed, Lean Data, by Acumen, and now it's pioneered by us, is because we were Acumen and we spun out of Acumen and started serving, of course, funds first. And then started working directly with organizations that had direct impact on its users. In this case, what I'm going to start with is this more unitary level example on the direct impact lens. So when an organization, a company, an NGO that has direct relationship with its end users come to us, they usually want to understand who are they reaching. Of course, I know I'm reaching 1,000, 2,000, 1 million MSMEs or end users, but who are they actually? Not only by socio-demographic data, but also with additional data that is eventually going to allow us to segment impact information and see if that impact is experienced differently by different segments. And therefore, our product or service has to be tailored to those segments. So who are they reaching? Then, of course, what social outcomes they are experiencing, but maybe most importantly, why are those outcomes being experienced? Part of the methodology is a mixed method, quantitative, qualitative methodology that allow us to understand the drivers behind the outcomes that are being experienced. And then, of course, the experience or satisfaction of that process that is quite related to the insight I shared on the Latam report. And whether the model that that NGO, that company, that startup is pushing forward is actually advancing those specific outcomes that are being identified. And if yes or no, how can we use this data to scale that impact or improve the intervention so that impact is actually the best possible for that end user? Those are usually the questions that organizations come with when they come directly to us. Why does this matter? I'm trying to said it at the beginning, because we're listening directly to the end users, because it's a very human way to measure impact, but also because it's user intelligence and because it's benchmarked and mostly actionable at that organizational level. The benchmark aspect is even more relevant at the portfolio level, and I'm sure Pranav and Mariana are going to go deeper into that. But now let's go directly into the Estímulo case. We did a study with Estímulo where we surveyed 400, more than 400 of their loan applicants, and we went a bit further with them and include a sort of comparison group with borrowers and non-borrowers. Lucas is going to give a bit more of information on this study. He's going to mention a bit more of Estímulo to begin with on why they decided to start working with micro and small enterprises and what trends they have been seeing in financial inclusion in this particular segment in Brazil. They're going to share, or Lucas is going to share, what motivated him and Estímulo to kick off a 60 decibels study, impact performance impact study, specifically focusing their MSME borrowers and non-borrowers, and some of the key data, key insights that they got, and what actions they took based on these insights. So without further ado, I'm super happy to introduce Lucas, and please, Lucas, go ahead and open your mic.
Carla, Pranav, thank you so much for having us. It's a great pleasure to be speaking about this work. It was a great experience working with 60 decibels, and it gave us a lot of insights on our model. I'm Lucas. I'm Brazilian. I'm based in São Paulo, and I'm currently CEO of Estímulo. Estímulo is a Brazilian nonprofit organization that supports small and micro business through blended finance vehicles. So we basically give accessible credit and also capacity building to entrepreneurs all across the region. And we currently manage two funds, one focused on financial inclusion and helping entrepreneurs access affordable capital and business support, and the second one focused on climate resilience, supporting entrepreneurs affected by climate-related disasters. The study with 60 decibels was focused on the first fund, and the story behind the first fund is really important because it explains why we wanted to better understand our impact. The stimulus started as a relief fund during the pandemic, and the challenge at the moment was very clear. Small business needed urgently access to capital, and they needed quickly. And our mission was very simple: provide accessible financing to entrepreneurs when they most needed it. We were inspired by the relief funds during in the USA, and we partnered together with fintechs in Brazil to really create a model to disburse these resources in a really fast way. And as the emergency passed and the organization matured, and we started bringing not only donation but also investments, we started asking ourselves a different question. What is our value beyond those emergency situations? And if the entrepreneur is no longer facing an immediate crisis, what role should Estímulo play in their growth? And that's when these investors came in, and I see that Bianca Auriemo from Right Capital is here with us today. Right Capital, Fernanda Camargo is one of the founders of this multifamily office. I think it's the most important family office focused in impact in Brazil. And she's friends with Sasha, and she spoke a lot about 60 decibel measurement and how 60 decibel could help us bring insights to our operation. So the question led us to this impact measurement exercise, and what made us very valuable was that we included both borrowers and non-borrowers, as Carla mentioned. So we wanted to understand the experience of both of the groups, and some findings reinforced what we believed, which was very good. Like, borrowers supported strong improvements in business outlook, quality of life, financial stability, and especially stress reduction. Maybe because we started during the pandemic and really help those entrepreneurs during difficult times. And the research also highlighted particularly strong outcomes for women entrepreneurs in all kinds of ways, reinforcing a strategic priority that already existed in the organization. And other findings really challenge us. One example was the training and capacity building exercise. While we believed the education is an important part of our model, and we always bring credit together with capacity building, the studies showed that a strong and consistent perception did not show a strong and consistent perception from the training alone. So we work with a model that Acumen also does it, which is micro learning through WhatsApp. So a lot of the entrepreneurs never understood that as a kind of capacity building initiative. And rather than seeing this as a negative result per se, we treat it as an opportunity. At the same time, right after 60 decibels, we conducted an internal study with more than 6,000 loans, and that revealed that the entrepreneurs who participated in some kind of form of Estímulo training, mentoring, a business development program, showed significantly lower default rates than those who had not. While that does not prove causality, it raised an important question about the relationship between engagement, capacity building, and business performance. So bringing together 60 decibels results and our internal analysis, we started redesigning our training strategy. And together here with us today, we have Vanessa Soki, which is the head of the education strategy of Estímulo, and also Lina Shain. And we are really redesigning our interventions to the moments that matter most to the entrepreneurs. We're not going to bring capacity all throughout their growth, but really look at these pinpoints. Before credit is disbursed for some specific kind of entrepreneurs, and during the grace period, when entrepreneurs are making really critical investment decisions. And we are also investing in more heavily tailored programs designed for specific sectors, for specific territories, and entrepreneurs' profile, rather than this really broad general purpose training. And we are doing this partnering with big corporations such as Ambev, Energisa, iFood. And we see that those really specialized, tailored programs are where entrepreneurs understand the most value out of capacity building. And on the woman lens, the study also reinforced our commitment. We combined with data from our portfolio that showed that women entrepreneurs had way less default rates than women entrepreneurs, and they were experiencing a lot of more impact out of our capacity building. We are now actually building a structure and dedicated lending vehicle focused exclusively on women entrepreneurs. So it really became a strategy within the organization. But perhaps the most important lesson was even broader. What I think the study ultimately reinforced is that the entrepreneurs do not experience Estímulo as a loan product. They experience it as a support system. They access to capital, of course, it matters, but so does guidance, trust, knowledge, network, and long-term support. So it made us realize that our role is not simply finance entrepreneurs, it's to help them succeed. And credit is one of the tools to make that happen. So for us, I think the greatest value of working with the 60 decibel and this impact measure was not validating our work, but really helping us understand how to create more impact in the future.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for that detailed information, honestly. I remember when we got the insights, I remember the gender segmentation and how interesting that was. And I'm super happy to hear. I know you were mentioning that you were like adapting and using insights based on that to better target women entrepreneurs. And I love to hear the advances now. So it's super interesting. And I am sure there are going to be more questions for you. But just to keep with the time, I'm going to share my screen again. So we go over to Pranav and the portfolio view. And please, if you have any questions for Lucas, for the Estímulo case, the direct impact case, we've already started receiving a bunch in the Q&A. Thank you for start doing that. Please go ahead and add others. We're going to be sure to answer them at the end. And thank you once again, Lucas. I am a fan of Estímulo and you know it. So let's go ahead, share screen again, and over to you, Pranav.
As I do that, Carla, just seconding everything you said, Lucas, the points around valuable non-causal insight, the element of segmentation, insights that are both demonstrating your impact, but also improving it through other means, super, super well noted, and really, really exciting to bring some of this work to life. Two very quick notes before diving into this exciting next segment with Mariana is when we think about our work at a portfolio level, a big part of it is scaling up in a certain way the work that Lucas just described. So the types of questions that a lot of our impact investor partners are curious about are similar to the ones Carla just mentioned. When we are looking at a diverse portfolio of financial service providers across different countries or across different parts of the same country or some companies that are financial service providers, some that are agri-focused, some that might be in the off-grid energy space, the question still remains, across these different models, who is being reached? Not just how many people are being reached, but are these people in rural or urban areas? Are they where across the socioeconomic spectrum they lie, so that we can really hold ourselves accountable to inclusivity in a multidimensional manner? And so that same question applied across the portfolio lens is something that a lot of our impact investor partners care about. Um, and I'll come to this soon, but the idea is also the same applies to other indicators around outcomes, around customer support. So, Luca spoke and Carla did as well about the relationships between quality of life and, customer satisfaction. Where does that hold? Where does that not happen? Because we have many instances where those two don't correlate. And why that is the case are the types of questions that at a portfolio level, an investor is often curious about. And the reason this portfolio level perspective is super important is because the analogy we often think about is when you look at your financial performance of a portfolio, especially if it's a for-profit fund, the idea is there's a level of standardization that helps you understand the dynamics of different companies when looking at the same way of measurement. We want to really and are excited to work with leading impact investors on a similar approach, but in the impact space. It's much harder, it's much more complex, but being able to bring a combination of standardized metrics and more custom metrics enables organizations to get that portfolio view. And the last thing I'll say here is one of the challenges we've heard from investors is how different investors might be looking at different indicators when thinking about impact. And so when we work with a particular portfolio company across multiple investors or multiple companies across investors, their ability to look at the same source of truth and think about impact is something that helps them come together when thinking about how best to support companies. And then the one thing I'll mention is earlier, there used to be the idea of impact measurement after a grant or after an investment. And Carla, if you can move to the next slide, the one thing I just wanted to sort of reframe is the fact that as we go along the entire journey and you can sort of take it through, the idea is really that impact is an input into every step of the investment process. By accessing data, we have now worked with thousands of social businesses around the world, and the goal is not just to have that data post-investment, but have a pipeline of impact investment opportunities earlier on, where you not just have financial performance, but impact performance data to be able to ask the right questions about where impact is strong, and not just right, wrong, good, bad, yes, no, but asking the right questions to inform how those opportunities can be developed and how investors can support the company through the investment life cycle on their financial health, but also on their impact performance. And so having the kind of high quality benchmarks at screening, diligence, and making the investment decision, being able to, as Luca said, not just prove the impact to an investment committee or a board, but say, this is where the impact is good and this is the ways in which we're going to improve it, or this is where the impact or the client protection or the customer risk is high and this is how we're going to reduce it, is the intention of this work. But that is really enough about our work at 60 Decibels and how we work with partners. And I'm so excited to now turn over to Mariana. And as I do that, the one thing I'll say as we go specific into Brazil is recognizing that Credit Saison Brazil, and Mariana will tell us a lot more, was established in 2023 and invests at the intersection of financial inclusion and technology. And they currently manage about 140 million US dollars in the country. And so it's a country of tremendous focus for you at the moment, Mariana. And so my first question really is, obviously you have a global footprint, you're trying to sort of expand your impact presence around the world, but what prompted your entering the Brazilian market, and what trends have you seen in recent times in the financial inclusion space there?
Thanks, Pranav, and thanks for having me. Happy to answer this question because, as you mentioned earlier, right, the story for us for a company started with like 75 years ago in Japan. And then more recently, we expanded into Latin America, which is probably not the most natural move, right? But then to your question, right? So Brazil, so you said, we operate at the intersection of financial inclusion and technology, right? So fintech. Brazil, from that aspect, was a natural next step for us. It's today's largest economy in Latin America. You have about 17 million people, like formal wage earners, on the negative list today in Brazil, right? So we're talking about people who are essentially locked out of the traditional credit system. So if you think about it, it's not a niche gap, it's a structural exclusion at scale, right? So for us, I think there were at least three factors that I can think of that really kind of like accelerated our expansion in Brazil. One was definitely the Brazil's fintech infrastructure that, by the time we started to explore, Brazil had matured, very much supported by quite a progressive central bank that had, as a deliberate agenda to increase competition in a highly concentrated banking sector. Right, so there were policy choices that created the conditions for people like us, right, and for digital credit to reach people that essentially banks, weren't reaching, right? So we are just also talking about, and then Lucas knows this very well, population with strong adoption of new technologies and smartphones. Right? So this is one. Second aspect, definitely a whole new generation of genuinely innovative fintechs that had built data-driven underwriting models really to serve this population. Those were, already backed by quite sophisticated global VCs who understood the opportunity. And I think three, definitely a real gap in institutional capital, right? So talking about those companies, those fintechs, growing fast, right? At some point, they couldn't access the type of patient structured funding they needed to scale responsibly. So I think we definitely saw a gap and something that we could address. To answer your second part, and the second part of the question related to the trend, right? I think what we've been tracking quite closely is the rapid rise of consumer lending as a vehicle for financial inclusion. Right? So alongside productive credit, right, microfinance, SME loans, working capital, agri-finance, you name it. We in Brazil are increasingly backing fintechs that are proposing solutions for non-productive needs. Right? So we're talking about buy now, pay later, salary advance, loans for education, housing, healthcare, right? So they come with a common proposition, which is a significant reduction of transaction costs for end clients, with specific, quite often urgent needs, right? So this matters a lot because financial exclusion is not just about absence of a bank account, right? If you think about it, it's the family that, cannot buy medicine at the end of the month. It's the worker that has to cover unexpected bills before payday, right? So not everybody wants to build a business, and then not everybody needs this type of loan. So these needs that we see are real recurring needs. And I would say this specific shift from inclusive productive lending to inclusive consumer credit as a pillar of financial inclusion is really one of the most important developments we've seen in Brazil.
Thanks so much, Mariana, for that comprehensive update. First on the policy drivers, the VC sort of support for earlier stage companies, and the gap which you came in to fill, which is institutional capital for these organizations. And then specifically this trend around productive to consumer lending and the opportunities and the risks that come with that we need to be aware of, which then sort of segues me to my next couple questions, Mariana, which is, in that ecosystem, in that landscape, what prompted your working with us at 60 Decibels? And just if you could also share some of the examples of insights or indicators that really stood out to you, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks. So we as an impact-driven lender, we provide access to finance for underserved MSMEs and individuals, right? So on the consumer lending, just maybe diving into this because this was really like the example for us in Brazil. So the reason why we reached out to you last year was because we were increasingly exposed to this type of service providers or this type of clients, right? So for us, there was a real, I'd say, evidence gap, right? I've been in the impact investing sector for roughly 15 years, and then there's a wealth of literature on productive credit. Again, decades of microfinance research, randomized controlled trials on agri-finance, and then you name it. When it comes to consumer and individual lending, the documented evidence base is very thin. Especially in a country like Brazil, right? So if I'm going to back the thesis that consumer credit can be a genuine instrument of financial inclusion and not just a debt trap with a nice fintech as interface, I need evidence, right? Not just assumption. So I think that was the first main reason. Second, I also wanted to have a honest honest view on the risk for end clients, right? Not only the positive outcomes, like what is shiny and bright, but really, if you think about it, financial inclusion, right? So access alone tells you nothing about whether product is improving the person's situation or whether it's actually quietly worsening it, right? So the question of clients' well-being doesn't surface in standard impact framework or assessment, that usually rely on outputs rather than outcomes. So the only way for us to get an accurate answer is to go directly to clients and hear the negative alongside the positive from the people who experience this. So last year we reached out to you. We wanted to conduct this client survey with one of our partners named Facio, and it was a natural starting point. So Facio serves salaried individuals who for many different reasons are credit invisible, right? So we kind of wanted to test the impact claim that short-term salary advance improves financial well-being for people with no other options, right? So that's exactly why we reached out to you. When we looked at the findings, I think there were a few that really stopped us in our tracks. One on additionality. So when you look at the findings, you have about 40% of Facio's customers that reported having no other source of credit, right? So you have about 41% that on top of this said it would be difficult for them to find an alternative, right? So this directly addresses one of the hardest questions in impact investing, which is, would this have happened, the outcomes that you observe, would those have happened without us, right? And for a significant share of Facio's customers, I think the answer is clearly no. On inclusion, about 20% of them said it was the first ever loan from a formal financial institution, right? So 1 in 5 customers. On other outcomes, 75, I think, reported, 75% reported improvement in quality of life. 72 said they spend less time worrying about money, right? A lot of customers, and I think was a very good wake-up call for me. A lot of those customers told us about the peace of mind, right? Most of us here, I think we can all relate. Financial stress is a real burden, and removing this has a real value, right? Us as impact lenders, like most of us, the traditional metrics we use would never capture this, right? We have number of loans disbursed, we have, number of clients disbursed, number of clients reached, but we don't necessarily capture this as part of the standard practice. So I think it was really nice for me to get to see that again, because we tend to forget this whenever we try to streamline and harmonize frameworks, right? I think something else that I want to add here is maybe the customer profile, right? We're talking about fintechs and then consumer loans. So sometimes people also wonder who are the people behind those services. And I think in the case of Facio, the average user is a 39-year-old head of household supporting on average 3 people, right? So we're not talking about, students experimenting like a nap, right? It's a working adult responsible for a family. And this, I think, again, was a very good book.
Super, super helpful, Mariana. I have so many more follow-up questions about the data itself, but I'm just conscious of time. And so one, if you could summarize for us maybe in a minute or a minute and a half, what is the so what of this in terms of working with them? Because as Lucas mentioned as well, it's about not just proving or validating, but also improving impact. So could you just say a little bit for us about that before we move to Q&A?
Yeah, in a minute and a half then. So I think the first aspect for us as a lender, right? I think it definitely sharpened our conviction as a lender, not as a rubber stamp, right? So the findings, so that the client voice data from this survey, this was really meaningful input to our credit committee. Like when a few months after we did the survey, we considered a top-up line for Facio, right? And then the nature of the conversation we had during this credit committee had nothing to do with the previous one, right? I think we were really able to balance financial considerations and impact consideration, and it raised a lot of questions for the credit committee, who usually doesn't necessarily challenge too much the impact and social aspect of a transaction, right? So I think this is one. More importantly, I'd say the study really has done is really help us raise the bar for how we assess any consumer finance position today, right? So what's true for Facio is not necessarily true for all consumer lenders, right? So consumer credit can generally transform lives, right? But it can also deepen indebtedness for clients, right? And increase financial stress. So clients' voices this is really what allows me and us as lenders to tell the difference, right? And And then we intend to really scale this practice. So in Brazil, we have 30 portfolio companies across different themes like MSME, climate, essential services. So the ambition here is really to increase our impact management practice and then really integrate client-grounded evidence base as part of this. I think finally, one last word, if I may. I think going forward, we see a real role for technical assistance and advisory. As an impact-driven lender, I think we can help portfolio companies build their internal capacity to listen to clients regularly and really translate this into product development, operational decisions, right? And then slowly we can move from impact reporting as just a compliance exercise to something that is more like impact intelligence as a management tool. So I think this is really important. And I think longer term, we are also interested as a lender to see how client outcomes can inform loan structuring, right? So if a fintech can prove it's genuinely improving lives, this should be reflected in the cost of capital, right? And then really linking those two things to me really create the incentive structure that reinforces the right behaviors from portfolio companies all the way through the system, right?
Just love that, Mariana. And I just want to say just the level of depth, right from the investment committee example or the credit committee example, rather, the raising the bar of the conversation. Like we would love to have a follow-up conversation to learn more about how that's actually happening as something that we can even take to others. And then, I mean, impacting financing and really being able to put our money where our mouth is, where we value, reward, impact for what it's worth, is something that I know there's a lot of movement on and sounds like this is a step in that direction. So thanks so much for that. With that, Carla, I can see we've already started touching upon some of the questions in the Q&A chat. So over to you to lead us away.
Amazing and wonderful conversation, Pranav, Mariana. Thank you. I also really like the point you made on the advisory aspect of seeing impact measurement less as compliance, and also as a tool that can be useful from a customer intelligence perspective and even more a product or cost of capital perspective. I think it's a conversation that is definitely for today and the future. So thank you for raising that point. Okay, so thank you everyone for sharing your questions, both on the chat, on the Q&A section. There are some questions that have more likes, so we're gonna start with those. I'm gonna start with one that has the most, and then maybe start with some that are specifically directed to Lucas and Mariana. So I've already read the first, and Pranav, I'm happy to go ahead and answer this one. You can complement, and I'm gonna share another one for Lucas that I see that has some votes, and Mariana as well. So the first one that we have here is, where does impact measurement most often fail inside an organization? At the data collection stage, the analysis stage, etc., etc. The reason I love this question is because I would say every single attempt to try impact measurement is a good attempt, but it is a failed attempt if we don't try to improve after that. The thing is, it's always going to be challenging to measure impact, even if you start doing it yourself. There's actually a question for Lucas directed at that and how they started with impact measurement. But from the 60 decibels perspective, I'd say that the biggest challenge, because we have a lot of experience in surveying metrics, in designing the appropriate samples so results are not biased, which is super important. But the most challenging aspect, I'd say, is data collection. Because, and mostly also in the case of Brazil and the growing interest in Amazon interventions, products, services in between others, they are hardest to reach beneficiaries and users, clients in between others. And the fact that they are hardest to reach makes it more obvious that their voices are not being listened to. So that makes it very complicated for us also to collect data in local languages. And that's where we're trying to improve the most. And I'd say that's from the impact measurement perspective, like the organization applying the impact measurement. But I'm pretty sure that Lucas and Mariana might have other experiences or complementary experiences. Before moving on to the next question, I would love for Pranav, if you have any perspective also on this, or if Lucas, Mariana, you would like to share what are the most challenging aspects of data collection. But please, Pranav,
I'd be very curious to hear Lucas, Mariana, your perspectives, because you'll work R1, work with them very.
I think this can essentially fail at every stage. I think that's the hardest part, right? I think data collection, aggregation, reporting. I think data collection for me is probably the trickiest because it really implies stakeholder engagement, right? You really need to explain to your portfolio companies why you're doing this, because it is a burden. Like we are requesting data from them that sometimes, they cannot collect, and then they cannot send to you, right? In our case in Brazil, we are actually quite often the first impact-driven lender coming in, right? So we actually, most of the time, the first lender uh, mentioning impact or ESG to them, right? So I think it's a huge learning curve usually, and they don't have the capacity. So building this practice from the beginning, from scratch, is already quite something.
Thank you, Mariana. And Lucas.
Yeah, Marianne, I really resonated on that as the person that gets the investments, and investors are demanding more impact, right? It's a lot of effort, like building an operation around impact measurement and really balancing the friction and the type of information that you want. Because before a credit is disbursed, the entrepreneur really wants to talk to you and explain and give you a lot of information. But throughout the loan process, it's really hard to get information from that entrepreneur. So you have to really balance when you're directly requesting more information. And one of the things we are designing is requesting more information when there is a new loan. When the person comes for a new loan, he has to give some impact information to us. So that really helps us. But really, like building this inside the operation, that you have like constant information, it's always a difficult thing to do.
Maybe here, if I may, as a tip for, if it can be useful, like really start small. Start with like what the company already has in place, and then really request for data that you will use. I think you have like a lot of like metrics frameworks out there, and then they look sophisticated, and then you really want to like adopt and align with the highest practice. But I mean, we've tried at first, but I mean, it's just a lot of data, and eventually you don't do much with them. So it's fine to have maybe just 5-10 data points, and then you start with this and you build on.
Yeah, really good point, Mariana. And start simple, start with less metrics and make them super, super useful. And
Yeah.
the next question is directed at Lucas. And actually, it's related to how you did impact measurement before. So it's before 60 decibels, how was Estímulo measuring impact and what was missing from that picture? And maybe, Lucas, while you're doing that, if you can share a bit more how you see other actors similar to Estímulo in the Brazilian ecosystem doing this.
Okay, so before 60 decibels, well, we started as a relief fund. So there was no impact measurement kind of a mindset. It was basically giving credit very fast and really helping those entrepreneurs to survive. And default rates at that point were a really high metric for us at the beginning. As we improved, we were looking mostly at outcomes. So basically connecting our data to public data to understand, for example, how many disbursements were in low-income regions, how many disbursements were targeted to women, how many disbursements were first access to credit. So it's basically connecting private data with public data. And we, of course, we had also customer research every year to understand the voices of the entrepreneurs. But when you're not targeting the questions through impact, what you get is mostly the customer experience, and you have the ones that were supported, they are lovers of the organization, and the ones that were not supporters, they are haters of the organization. So the basic company kind of measurement. And when we then started building a theory of change and understanding what we wanted to measure, and then afterwards it was 60 decibels program where we had this controlled group. And I think this was the most important, because you had entrepreneurs that were supported and entrepreneurs that were not supported, and really understanding that those both voices from a social lens, from an impact lens, was very, very important and very different for us. And when you're talking about other organizations, Carla, I actually don't see many in the fintech kind of organizations that such as us. We see other fintechs, but maybe the impact measurement goes to the investors and it's not really amplified in the Brazilian ecosystem. It's a perception. Like I don't follow many of the impact measurement of other fintechs. I don't get that much data on their strategy.
Uh, Thank you, Lucas. And that's a really interesting insight because maybe it is happening, but it's not being, as you said, amplified. And that would be an invitation here to those that are Brazilian, have Brazilian organizations. If you're doing it, go ahead and share it, or at least share you're doing it, so there can be a practice group at least to share this
Yes,
kind of information.
and I think it can be tricky for most of the companies to really share those raw datas and seeing that some of the outcomes you expected are not as you expected. It's sometimes treated as those critical kind of information. And we are as a nonprofit, and we full transparency on our what we're doing. I think there's another type of way of looking that and really sharing so that more people can engage with us and we can improve. So maybe that's a different way of seeing the results and sharing them.
Thank you, Lucas. And I know we are at time. There are so many questions. There's like four for you, Mariana. Um, I would love if those people that are still there, if you can answer in 1 minute, Mariana, just like one of these questions, and then we can get to a close, because it's a very interesting one and quite related to something you shared that is across your portfolio of the different organizations you're lending to. Do you ask for the companies for the same impact metrics, or what is the dynamic between you and them? As brief as you can share, and then we're gonna bring this session to an end. Thank you again for everyone who stayed until the end. Pranav, you are welcome to say some closing thoughts after Mariana has shared her inputs.
Yeah, let me try to answer this in 30 seconds. And then for, I mean, the other questions and people who would want to reach out and learn about our practice, feel free to reach out to me, or, elsewhere on LinkedIn. But to this question specifically, I would say there's a layer that is common to everyone. But I mean, obviously you don't ask the same questions, you don't investigate the same areas for, different sectors, different type of companies, more mature, more early stage, right? So I would say there's a layer that kind of helps us understand more of the breadth of impact, like the reach, right? And then those are, we call them impact metrics, but they're really like more outputs metrics. So there's this layer, but there's also another layer that I would consider as one of the most important pillars within impact is ESG risk, environmental and social risks. That is also a common layer that we ask all portfolio companies to make sure that at least we do no harm, right? So questions about how they interact with the customers, with the environment, the community, right? So there's always a common layer, and then we tailor the approach, we tailor the due diligence, the assessment, the analysis based on the maturity, the location, the type of company, whether it's a financial institution or SME, right? So there are different ways of doing this. I think as much as possible we standardize, but we know that there's only so much you can standardize, and then it always requires a certain level of tailored approach. I hope it's clear.
Super, super clear, Mariana. And just to say, I was sort of furiously typing because there were so many interesting questions which ask questions at the intersection of the value of impact measurement, when it sort of goes from being more useful to less, the challenges with it, etc. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of them. Hopefully, you've got some responses. But whoever the target person for your question was, please feel free to reach out to us via LinkedIn or email. Carla and myself at 60 Decibels, Mariana, of course, from Saison International, and Lucas from Estímulo. No other reflections, Carla, except to say this has been so energizing and such specific, valuable insights from both Mariana and Lucas. And we'd be delighted to work with those of us who had joined this conversation and many others as we deepen our work in Brazil. So those are just my parting words, Carla. Feel free to say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you, everyone. And there is an Estímulo webinar coming up. Please register. We're going to share more info on the follow-up email. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Ciao.
everyone. Bye. Cheers.